Now we've simulated the tentacles with both vellum hair curves and with soft bodies, but I prefer the behavior of the curve simulation more than the soft body one, so that's the one I'm going to go with to apply it to the creatures that are flying around the scene. Of course, you can use whichever version you prefer for your own projects. And I've cleaned up my scene a little bit here for this hair curve simulation. And currently, we have the body split separately and the tentacles being point deformed by the simulated curves. And now I'm going to just merge these together so that we can apply them along the path deformations that we've already set up for those creatures earlier. So let's merge together this body and the tentacles, and then add a new null. And I'm going to call this Creature Tentacle Sim. And if you're finding it a little bit slow for your scene to evaluate this point deformation for the tentacles all the time, you could perhaps add in another file cache after this point deform here. But I'm not finding this too terribly slow at this point, so I'm just going to leave this live in the scene. And then to apply these moving tentacles to the actual animated creatures, let's go back to where we previously set up the flying creatures. So in this flying creature basic geometry object here, this has the creatures flying through space with this very basic procedural noise for their tentacle motion. So if we just copy this creature flying basic, and we're going to turn off the display for that, and then go down to our week 4 vellum section, and then paste that in here. And I'm going to call this creature flying simulated. And then if we dive inside the creature flying simulated and go over to where it's merging in this creature, instead of merging in the creature with this basic procedural noise animation, we can just instead point this to the version with the simulated tentacles. So on that object merge, let's point this to object / vellum tentacles / creature tentacle sim. Now previously we had disconnected squid number 1 because that one is getting disintegrated and we just want to display that one from the disintegration geometry object. But just for now, I'm going to reconnect this so we can see them all together. And then let's display our out deforming creatures null and go back to our wide render camera. So now we can see these creatures have that tentacle sim as they're moving through the scene here. And let's do a flipbook to see what this looks like. Now checking out our flipbooked scene, this is looking pretty cool. I really like how these tentacles look in motion. It looks like just the right flowing behavior that I had in mind for this shot. And there are a couple issues here. Most notably is that all of the tentacles are doing the same thing between the 3 creatures. It's not necessarily always obvious. For example, this creature at the bottom here, it doesn't really look like the same shape because it's at a different angle. So in some cases it's not very problematic, but these 2 above it are pretty clearly doing the same thing. So we need to start time offsetting these creatures. And also when we're setting up our time offsets, we want to, as I mentioned in a previous video, avoid the first 50 frames or so, because the creatures are starting out perfectly straight and the initial frames of the simulation don't look super nice, the way that the tentacles just start moving there and it takes a moment for them to resolve into their nice natural motion. So we're going to avoid using the very beginning of the sim frames and make sure the time offsets are all different. And this was a bit slow to simulate, or I should say a bit slow to flipbook. So this took about 5 minutes for me to run the flipbook for this whole scene. So you certainly could try caching out the creatures after their path deformation to see if that speeds things up a bit. So going back inside our network here, just before each of these out squid nulls, you can try dropping in a file cache there and see if caching that out speeds your scene up overall. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. The 5-minute flipbook isn't bothering me too much. So now let's go to a frame that's particularly problematic with the matching shapes between the creature's tentacles. It looks like frame 100 is a good one to test on. So I'm just going to drop in a time shift before each of these path deformations. So we'll drop that after the creature scale before that gets path deformed. And I already have a time offset preset for my time shift here. But if you don't have that set up yet, you can just add a new parameter for that offset. So go to Edit Parameter Interface and drop in a new float parameter. Just call this offset. Same thing for the name. And if you want to, you could set the range to something like -1 to 1, which is helpful for checking the subframes just before after the current frame. But when you have this lock icon turned off here, that means you can still set values above or below this existing range here. So after setting that parameter, hit accept, right click that offset parameter, copy that, and then go up to our frame expression here. And we'll want to turn off integer frames so that we can allow some subframes if we want. And for the frame number, I'll set that to $FF instead, which will give us the actual decimal frame number, not just the nearest integer frame. And then type plus and right click to paste in that relative reference that we copied from the offset. And then you can save this as a new preset. So if I click the frame number to see what frame it's pulling in here, let's go back to frame 100, which I said is a good test frame. And I'll zoom in a little closer on our creatures here. Now for squid number 2, which is the one that I've dropped this time shift on here, I'll just try an offset of 100. Of course, you can tweak this to your liking until you get a nice shape out of the simulation. That looks pretty good. And now let's zoom in on squid 1 and copy this time shift and then drop it before the path deform for that squid number 1. Make sure to connect it after the creature scale, not on the path input here. And for this one, let's try a time offset of 250 and see what that looks like. Maybe 350 has a slightly nicer shape to it. And then zooming in on the third creature here, let's set a different time offset for this guy. So down on that third path deform, this one already has a time shift after the path deform to control the timing of this creature emerging from the ground, but we don't have to worry about that. We'll still drop this additional time shift just before the path deform first input there. For this one, I'll try something like 500. That seems fine. And just to keep our scene nice and clean, let's add the extra out squid null on this one. So this third one will be out squid 3. And now let's do a new flipbook with our updated tentacle timings. And now reviewing our new flipbook, which I've set to a dark background to better represent what this will look like when it's actually rendered. Things are looking pretty cool. All of the tentacles are unique per creature. The behavior looks all nice. We're avoiding that weird beginning portion of the simulation. And this looks all good. And now going back into our network here, we can once again disconnect squid number 1 because this will be displayed from the disintegration geometry object instead. And now I'd like to point out one more thing to watch out for here. And when I was rendering these creatures, I found that there were certain frames of the render where the creatures would show some glitchy motion blur artifacts. It didn't happen on very many frames, just the occasional frame here and there. And motion blur issues are something that are very common to run into, and they can be caused by various different things depending on what you're rendering and how you're rendering it. But in this particular case, I found that some of these little motion blur glitches were fixed by adding in a time blend after our creature scale here. So if you display this creature scale, and let's hide other objects and just zoom in on that, we can check the subframes on this by using our time offset preset on a time shift here. So I will call this subframe check, select my time offset preset, which has a range of -1 to 1 on the offset parameter. So as we move this up and down, this will smoothly blend between the frame before and after the current frame. So let's display that subframe check, take a look at what's happening on those subframes, and it's pretty smooth in this case. It doesn't look like there are any interpolation issues on this frame. It's kind of subtle, it's not moving a lot, but if we zoom in on the tentacles and then move that offset, yeah, it looks like this is pretty smooth on all of these subframes here, so that's good to see. Another thing you might want to check if you're running into issues is to show the point numbers, and you want to make sure that the point numbers are consistent on the subframes as well. And this may be a little bit difficult to look at, but this is something you can check. As you scroll through these subframes again, make sure that none of these point numbers are changing. So that looks all good, but as I said, I did run into some motion blur issues when rendering these creatures. And in my case, that was fixed just by dropping in a time blend after the creature scale here. So if you type in time blend and drop that in there, we can just leave all of the default parameters on this. The blend will not use velocity for interpolation by default, which is fine. We just want this to do a raw position interpolation. The shift range mode is actually not going to shift anything in time here, at least by default. It says frame 1 through 100 here, but that's doing a post extend, so that'll be valid throughout the whole time range. And it's up to you if you want to add this in right away, or just wait and see if you're running into those little motion blur glitches. In my case, I'm just going to leave that in there, just in case. And if you do a file cache after the path deform for the creature, you may or may not find that you need to apply that time blend fix after that. So with our time blend added in here, I'll put the display flag back on our outdeforming creatures. And we also need to update the render object. So go back up to the object context and go up to our render creatures object here. Dive inside that. And instead of pointing this to creature flying basic, we'll change this object merge to point to creature flying simulated and out deforming creatures. And with the tentacle sim now applied to these flying creatures, we can go ahead and rerun our disintegration sim.